This meeting is being recorded.
Greetings and welcome to Mount Olympus. I am Hercules Invictus and I'm glad you're here. This is our first Mythic Monster panel and we'll be investigating vampire tribes. On our first crossover episode with Living Hellenismos, we looked at ancient Greek vampires, the Vrikolakas, the Impusa, and the Lamia. There are a few more, but they're a bit more obscure, and even the ones I've listed are not very well known. So that is how we started our journey, and now we're going to be looking at vampires further afield. We have awesome panelists tonight, each with their own area of expertise, and together we'll get a bigger picture. This will not be our only vampire tribes panel. This is the first. There'll be several more scattered throughout the year while we investigate other monsters. So I guess we will pass the baton around first to my lovely wife, Athena Victory. Please say a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go around the clock.
Hello, I'm Athena Victory. Hercules is my husband. We actually met at a horror convention. We met at the Chiller Theater Convention, but before that we had met in places like the Famous Monsters Convention and other venues because we were both fans. And something else just popped up. I don't know why. Anyway, I'm going to cover tonight some literary vampires pre-Dracula and pretty much how some of them influenced Bram Stoker's presentation, because the Dracula vampire, the one that Bram Stoker came up with, is the one most people is familiar with, but it had its roots in other literary vampires. So that's what I'm going to cover today. I review sometimes the Amigo action horror action figures on my YouTube channel. We put the "we" on Halloween, so if you want to see the crazy fangirl stuff I do for Universal Monsters and the like, that would be where you'd find me.
Thank you very much. Brian Walker.
Thank you, Hercules. This is Brian Walker of Brian's Drive-In Theater, and tonight I'm going to be talking about Bram Stoker's Dracula and the visual representations that we have of Count Dracula in film, starting with silent films and working up through the present.
Thank you very much. Circe the Enchantress. So good to finally see your face. Can you please introduce yourself and what you'll be presenting on tonight?
Hi, yeah, I will be presenting about the mythological aspects of the vampire culture, such as succubus and a Greek mythological child-eating monster. So those are the two topics that I will be talking about.
Thank you very much. Olav Phillips.
Yeah, thank you, Hercules. I'm Olav Phillips. I'm a 4chan researcher, and I was going to discuss vampires as the other and the global nature of the vampire mythos.
Very cool. And last but certainly not least, the legendary Tim Swartz.
Thank you, Hercules. Well, tonight I will talk about how vampires are still with us today. Not only when you look at movies and television and things like that, but also in the realm of cryptozoology and how vampires, or at least certain aspects of the vampire phenomena, are still presenting itself in various aspects.
Very cool. Thank you so very much. And now, without further ado, I pass again the scepter to Athena Victory. Start your presentation. You muted out. Athena, you muted out. You've been muted.
Hello?
Hi, okay, you're coming back. Okay, Athena will come back to you. Okay, we'll move to Brian and we'll take care of the sound problem, okay?
No sound whatsoever. Hello?
Okay, there you go, you're back.
Oh,
Okay.
good, I'm back. It's sort of ready to go testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'm going to talk about some literary vampires that were pre-Dracula. And keep in mind that some of the stuff is going to say for a later show, because I found out there was a lot of other things about vampires that had nothing to do with literature. They were in like scholarly papers and stuff from the 1700s well into the almost the early 20th century. So the first one I'm going to start out, the vampire that stood out first is John Polidori's The Vampire with Lord Ruthven. And John Polidori was Lord Byron's personal physician, was pretty much attracted and repelled by Byron because Byron was a bit of a sexual predator. And he came up with this dazzling young man who would go around with the upper classes and seduce women, and that would lead to their deaths. And his friend in that was named Aubrey. Aubrey followed him to Greece, and they're set upon by bandits. Looks like Ruthven is mortally wounded and says, don't tell anybody I died for a year and a day, but just drag my body so it can be bathed in the moonlight. And so Aubrey leaves him. Makes his way back to England and finds out that Lord Ruthven's alive and well and now seducing his sister. And Ruthven tells him, don't tell anybody, you made a promise. And Aubrey basically has a nervous breakdown, and his sister succumbs to Lord Ruthven. Now, what's interesting about this is before this, vampires were considered revenants. They were attacking the peasants. They were in the villages, and they really didn't have much of a personality. And Ruthven is the first vampire we see that's tied to the upper classes, and definitely has a personality. And he's very seductive, and he says he gluts the thirst of a vampire. Doesn't really mention the holes in the neck yet, but you know he's feeding off these women. And he resurrects by moonlight. He's probably been dead and alive several times. And he's a vampire from the get-go. There's never an origin for Ruthven how he became a vampire. But that brings us to the next one, which is the Varney the vampire from the Penny Dreadful. Varney is cursed. He was, he was betraying a royalist to Oliver Cromwell and then later killed his son. And Varney too would die and just resurrect again and again and again. Varney definitely had a personality, and the personality Varney had was a self-loathing vampire that didn't like his condition. And this later goes to what we know for characters like Barnabas Collin or Nick Knight, that you have the self-loathing vampire that really hates his curse. And Varney basically throws himself in Mount Vesuvius, and hopefully that's the end of him, and may he rest in peace. Varney showed up in Penny Dreadfuls, and he was Sir Francis Varney. So once again, you have an aristocratic vampire who can move in and blend with the public when he needs to for his seductions and everything. The vampire that had the most influence probably on Bram Stoker's Dracula might be Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. And that was written in 1872. And here we see a lot of aspects. She kind of is like a cuckoo in that she nests herself with these aristocratic families and becomes a companion to their daughters. And she's a lot more invested with these daughters than any of the menfolk in her lives. She feeds upon them, and she can shape change. She shape changes into a cat, a giant cat. And she goes from house to house, and it's usually an anagram of her name, Malarca, Mikala. And when she's hunted down finally, she's staked, decapitated, burned, and then they throw her ashes in the river, hoping that's the end of her. And they do mention this time fangs, because they mention 2 punctures, like needle marks, in the breast of her victims. I love the Ingrid Pitt movie, The Vampire Lovers. That's my favorite Carmilla, but that's what it was based on. Bram Stoker possibly took a little bit of Carmilla for Dracula's Guest, which was a little short story. And also for Carmilla showed up in a lot of movies and fiction, doing the lesbian vampire aspect that we see in Dracula's Daughter, The Vampire Lovers, Daughters of Darkness, and other things like that. Now, the last one I'm going to talk about was pretty much published a year before Dracula, And the action that was supposed to happen between 1875 and maybe 1876. And this is a vampire Kroglin Grange. Now, what makes this one interesting is we have a throwback now. The creature isn't aristocratic. It doesn't have a personality. It's very animalistic. And this story really freaked me out when I was a kid, because you have this people staying at a country house, two brothers and their sister. And it's a hot night, and she's got the shades, the curtains open, and she's looking out, and she sees two little pinpoints of light. And wow, they're moving. So she's watching, thinking, well, maybe they're fireflies, until it breaks the tree line and starts coming to the window, and she sees it's some sort of horrible creature. So she hurries, locks the door, runs to the door to leave the room, and then she hears a horrible sound, and it's the thing picking at the lead that's holding the window panes in place. And she freezes, just freezes, until it comes in and bites her in the throat, in which case she screams and her brothers chase it and you don't see it. Now, they're not really thinking that it's a vampire, or they're not really using the V word. They're thinking, well, this was an escaped lunatic that got out, and the family goes off to Switzerland for a while, recuperates, and eventually comes back to the area. Well, the same thing happens, only this time, as soon as she sees the thing, she screams for all she can, all she's worth. Her brothers come and they shoot at it, and they track it back to its grave. It's got a bullet wound in its leg, and they burn it. And people tried to figure out the historical Kroglin Grange. It was a Kroglin Low Grange Hall, perhaps. And there were vampire legends about that, but we don't get any idea of the personality of the vampire or who the vampire was supposed to be, other than it was there. And Augustus Hare said he heard this from, let me make sure I get the name correct, The Story of My Life. And he supposedly heard this from a captain that lived in the area. And so this was passed off as part of an autobiography. And this is, again, something that maybe Stoker heard of, but we don't know. So that was the difference with them, that you had aristocratic vampires up to that point, and then we have this throwback with the Revenant again. So that's pretty much the important ones.
Thank you, Athena. That was awesome. And that leads directly into Brian's presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Hercules. I actually used to teach Stoker's Dracula when I first started teaching literature in the late 1980s on the college level. And the reason that I wanted to use it was I wanted to get my students reading, because they were forced to take the class because it was a requirement for certain majors. And I had certain things that I needed to teach, like epistolary novels. And Bram Stoker's Dracula is a fantastic example of the epistolary. There is no one narrator in it. Everybody, every character is potentially a narrator. And Stoker uses a lot of what was then cutting edge technology. I mean, one of the narrative apparatuses is a dictation machine, which would have been brand new in the late 1890s. So its use of technology is very interesting and very cutting edge for that particular time. And with Stoker's Dracula, the image of the vampire not only as monster, but as a very charismatic being. He's protagonist and antagonist, one and all at the same time, really. So it makes him a very deep, very interesting character to take a look at. Many, I should say, but not most, but many of vampires, if you look back into lore, are fanged creatures. I mean, they're pretty gross. They're pretty disgusting. If you've ever seen Nosferatu, the 1922 German film with Max Schreck as Count Orlok, the monster, I mean, he's very repellent. He's oddly skinny, tall, and he's got these just gross, disgusting teeth. You never saw that with Bela Lugosi's Dracula. And there's several reasons for that. For one thing, the Dracula that we have come to know is largely from the Universal 1931 version of Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, who had done the role on the Broadway stage, prior to the movie being shot. He was not the studio's first pick for the role. As a matter of fact, he had to work for very, very little pay as the star of the film just to get the role. And even then, the executives weren't all that keen on it. He was not a native speaker. He learned a lot of his lines phonetically initially when he did come to the United States to continue his acting career. But he did a good job with it. And if you've ever seen any older photos of Bela Lugosi when he was in his, let's say, the 20s, 30s, 40s, very handsome man. Even in Dracula, and by this time he's nearing 50 years old. I'm not saying that you can't be 50 years old and handsome, but he still had that matinee idol look about him. And his visage is the one that we most often see in films today. A very charismatic monster, very well dressed, coiffed perfectly, and it's that version that almost makes it's a very erotic, sensual monster, and there's a bit of sexuality to it that you really can't deny. Now, in the Universal version from 1931, whenever Count Dracula finds a victim, let's say the girl selling flowers near the beginning of the film, you never see any penetration. You never see the teeth enter the neck, although the next day there will be two holes in Lucy's neck, for example, but you never really actually see the penetration. We don't get to see anything like that until Hammer began remaking all of those classic Universal monster movies in the late 50s. Christopher Lee is really the first fanged vampire that we see biting somebody, and the Hammer films used it to great effect, very garish color, often dripping with blood. And there's a famous picture of Christopher Lee, as Dracula, where he's got blood dripping from his fangs. In the late 1950s, that was pretty shocking. To see something like that, very different. Now he's also, a charismatic vampire, but actually not quite as much as Bela Lugosi. I think Bela Lugosi does have that aristocratic air that Stoker writes about so brilliantly in his novel. And with Christopher Lee's portrayal of the antagonist, there's a bit more of the animal there, and you can see it in his eyes and in the actions that he makes in his portrayal. It's a very interesting take on the vampire, whereas the vampire is at once both has his aristocratic airs, but on the other hand is a fiend, and his appetite has to be satisfied.
Thank you very much. That's excellent. That picked up perfectly from where Athena left off, and it brings us via the Carpathians and via Carmilla to the subject that Circe is going to be talking about, the succubus.
Hi. Okay, so yeah, I'll start with the succubus. The succubus is a traditional ideological person, the male counterpart being the incubus. So with that in mind, a succubus came about in legendary and the lores of culture. It was thought of to be Lilith, the first wife of Adam, and when she left Adam, she became a succubus or a demon that would entice men and then lure them into sexual relations. and the children then thus created would be demonic. And that was her punishment for leaving Adam, or for being wanting to be a free woman or of her own mind. And in a lot of religions, this is still thought of as being a reality, where like in Catholicism, they believe that men can be seduced in their dreams by a succubus to have relations, and somehow a demon is trying to take over their mind. And this is what we would normally refer to as a psychological vampire, or somebody that goes into your psyche and tries to take over your mind. So, and keep in mind, there is a male counterpart that is also recognized here. And they're usually depicted as having winged, like a winged demon, and the teeth as well. So the succubus is also looked at as an enchantress or some kind of siren that is irresistible to men. And this does date back to some type of mythological connections, such as in the Greek mythology, Lamia and Zeus. Now, you know, Zeus was a philanderer. He liked to have women, and Hera always staying by to punish the women that he was with. Lamia and Zeus had relations. She was a very beautiful woman, and Hera, finding out, cursed her to become very ugly and mutated as a monster, and stole the children that her and Zeus had, and then killed them. So Zeus gave her the power of prophecy and the ability to take out her eyes and put them back in. And but with that gain, Hera decided to curse her with insomnia. She would never be able to sleep because she would obsess about her stolen children and the loss of her children. So in order to satisfy her hunger for her lost children, she would go out and steal children and eat them. And the accounts of her look or a serpentine, she almost looks like a snake, like the serpentine figure, and so therefore also having the fangs. And so this is actually referenced in writings by Keats, and there was a poem, Lamia, that Keats wrote, and it references this mythology. So there are these allusions to vampiric type of forms of mythology through different cultures, and Greece has a couple of them, and so a lot of the other traditional, like Catholicism, Judaism, they also have these represented vampiric type of creatures that will steal your essence, your children, your sexual desires, and therefore fulfilling and satiating themselves to perpetuate whatever it is they are doing. So those are the connections to mythological as well as cultural references.
Thank you so very much. And now that you've opened up the floodgates to the world, we go to Olav Phillips, who's going to look at the vampire as a global phenomenon.
Sure. So one of the interesting things that I've always found about vampires as an archetype or a construct is that they actually exist, as we've heard from the other panelists. They actually exist out of time and space and location. Space means location, right? That when you look at the vampire phenomenon, that it is pervasive through all of human history, but also in most all geographies. So on one hand, you can have the legend of the skinwalkers in various forms throughout the First Nations people of North America. And they're represented as shaman, generally, that they can, of the darker variety, meaning, more of a negative context, and they can change shape, and They prey on people at night. In certain parts of Navajo areas, they will actually tell you don't go there at night because that is a skinwalker location and they will attack you. But conversely, you can go all the way to the Philippines, and in the Philippines they have something called the aswang. The aswang prey on lone travelers at night, and they live on an island that can only be seen at dusk, and the island is blood red, and the bodies of their victims float in the ocean around the island. But what's interesting is that just about every culture that you can find has some concept of the vampire. They're either cursed, they're rotting, they're degenerate, they're sex fiends. You know, they don't always prey on blood. Sometimes they consume their victims, but there's some sort of a taboo behavior that they all perform. And the taboo, it could be a sexual taboo. It could be, you know, a social taboo. They don't bathe, for example, in some cases. But they exist as a construct in just about every single society, going as far as we care to go in history. And it's interesting because the existence of the vampire archetype in pretty much all of human civilization, it lends itself to one of two choices. Either the vampire exists as the negative boogeyman in most all societies, and it is the negative other. If you're a bad kid, they will come and get you at night. If you walk by yourself, they will come and get you at night. It's this kind of cautionary tale of don't do things like that. You know, walk with a friend, don't go out at night. These things that you try to scare your children with, right? But on the other hand, because it is so pervasive, you could also make an argument that lends itself to the notion that it exists in some form. Now, as we've gone through time, it's become less of a physical thing, like a literal vampire, like in the Victorian times. Sorry, airplane. In the Victorian times, they literally had vampires, and they had, vampire hunting kits with stakes, so you could go stake vampires. Lots of, in Eastern Europe, they would behead bodies when they would bury them. They chop their head and their feet off because they believed that would prevent somebody from turning into a vampire, if they were a vampire, from walking the earth. But as we've gone through, we continue to have this archetype of the vampire, but now in our culture and society of today, now we have energy vampires, and we have all kinds of new types of vampires that we're kind of creating or that exist. But it really lends itself to a very important question. Does the vampire actually exist in some capacity in reality? Or is it just a cultural construct that we use to teach lessons? And I don't think that there's a clear answer there, because it is pervasive through all of human history. So I think that's a very interesting part of the vampire mythos.
And that's an important question to ask, Olav. And again, this is why this is going to be part of a series. I intend on us focusing on all of these questions in future episodes. Thank you very much, Olav. And that perfectly brings us to Tim Swartz and his presentation.
All right, thank you, Hercules. Well, I just want to say that like Athena and Brian, I was a fan of vampire movies, monster movies, Universal Hammer films from way back. But also there was a bunch of just really wild Mexican black and white vampire movies that came out, especially in the 1950s and early 1960s. You had like Nostradamus, the vampire, and they were all kind of patterned after Bela Lugosi, and they like Christopher Lee, they had fangs as well. And I was wondering, as Brian was giving his talk, who besides Max Schreck in Nosferatu, who was the first movie vampire that actually sported the fangs? So, I was thinking maybe it was Christopher Lee, who to me is the epitome of Dracula. And Olaf made a good point about the mythology of vampires and whether or not there was some basis of reality to them, or whether or not it was the almost like the unconscious fears intruding upon our everyday lives. But if you ask any kid who's laid awake in the dark, certain that there was some kind of unknown horror in the shadows under the bed, or anyone who's walked through a dark woods, keenly aware that there were inhuman eyes watching their every move, or you're in the night, you hear some kind of strange noise where there shouldn't be any strange noise. That can pretty much convince anyone that there are monsters, and it's a universal fear that goes back to when our earliest days, when we hid in the caves, wondering what was out there in the dark that was going to suddenly pounce on us and tear us limb for limb. I mean, we may be modern and supposedly sophisticated now, but those primitive fears still exist within us. And I think that if you look at a lot of these modern cases of unknown killings, whether it be people or livestock, that involve the draining of blood, it's no wonder that we still question this. You look at and I'm going to refer to my notes here, so I'll look down, occasionally. There in 1874, near, and I think this, I may not be pronouncing this right, near Cavan, Ireland, something killed as many as 30 sheep a night, biting their throats and draining the blood. And in 1905, in Great Badminton, Avon, sheep were again the target for attacks. Now, a police sergeant in Gloucestershire was quoted in the London Daily Mail as saying, "I have seen 2 of the carcasses myself, and I can say definitely that is important. It is impossible for it to be the work of a dog. Dogs are not vampires, and they do not suck the blood of a sheep and leave the flesh almost untouched." So, I mean, if you look at other cases like this throughout history, there are mysterious attacks, especially on livestock. But there have been people attacked as well, where the flesh may be mutilated, but the one thing that is often noticed is that there's no blood. Now, we do know that something that dies, if it's left untouched for a little while, the blood tends to pool in the lower extremities. But a lot of these cases, especially with cattle mutilations, which, I mean, cow's got a bunch of blood, there's no blood at all to be found. So, I mean, it's not a case where this was an animal that died and then, was chewed upon by coyotes or vultures. Again, these are animals that go for the flesh. They're not blood drinkers. And in fact, you look at vampire mythology, especially as done in the movies, the vampire bat is always predominantly displayed. The vampire, will turn into a bat. But it wasn't really until I think the 19th century that or maybe even early 20th century, that the vampire bat was even known about in South America. So up until that time, as far as we knew, there was only supernatural creatures that feasted on the blood of the innocent. I should also point out that there in, especially in Tennessee, South Pittsburgh, Tennessee, in mid-January 1934, something that was described as looking like a giant kangaroo, I kid you not, terrorized rural Marion County, which is along the Tennessee-Alabama border. Now, according to the local newspaper, there was a Reverend Hancock who saw the animal and said it was as fast as lightning as it ran, and it leapt across the field. The beast was reported to have killed and partially devoured geese, ducks, and several large dogs. All of these animals found with no blood. Now, this then brings me to, of course, the Chupacabra. The goat sucker, which was especially, first showed up in Puerto Rico. And this was an animal that, again, it seemed to like to prey on livestock and to drain their blood. There were some cases that have been, haven't received as much airplay, where some people reported to have been attacked by the Chupacabra, which, again, strangely enough, the description sounds almost like the bloodthirsty kangaroo of Tennessee. And it was I know there was one farmer who said that it bit him in his leg, and later, when he was examined, his leg had basically turned gray. It had shrunk down and eventually had to be removed, almost like the blood and everything else had been drained from it in just a short period of time. Now, I should also mention one of the things that to me sounds an awful lot like vampire mythology, and some other investigators have brought this up as well, is the black-eyed children. Now, these are cases that almost always, when these kids and some adults appear at your doorstep, they usually ask to be let in, which again goes back to old vampire mythology, where supposedly the vampire would stand outside your door or window and call your name, and only until you answered or gave permission for it to come into your house could it come in. And here you've got this new mythology, this new paranormal mythology of children with black eyes asking to come into your house and not being able to come in until you give them permission. And just about all of these cases, when people are confronted with these kids, even if they haven't seen their eyes yet, because a lot of times the kids will talk to the homeowner, and they'll have their heads bowed down so you can't see their eyes. The people are just overwhelmed with this malevolent fear that like their life is just immediately. I suppose it would be like if you were out in the jungle and suddenly were confronted by an apex predator, a lion or a tiger or bear. Oh my. You just have this primitive fear that you're going to die if you don't do something about it, and it's like that with the black-eyed children. So, and of course the Chinese mythology would look upon these as hungry ghosts. Again, we're faced with this idea that it seems like that there are supernatural, paranormal, however you want to categorize them, creatures, whether they exist in this world or in another, and are able to temporarily come to this world, or it really doesn't matter. But they seem to be able to subsist upon humans, either physically through blood, and humans and animals alike, or as I think it was Olav who pointed out, you had the energy vampires. Paul Eno has written a number of books talking about parasites, paranormal parasites that feed off of our energies and fears, usually manifesting themselves as a poltergeist. But there have been poltergeist cases where there does seem to have been a physical aspect where people have been bitten and maybe not drained of blood, but there is actually bloodletting taking place. Again, evoking that primitive fear of being eaten by some other creature, and of course, as I've written about in a number of books, there have been cases in modern ufology that is very much akin to the old vampire stories. And rather than cattle mutilation, you have human mutilations. I mean, there's a famous case that happened in Brazil where a human body was discovered that appeared to have been mutilated very much like cattle mutilations. Sexual organs were removed, lips were cut away, the eyeballs were taken out in a very surgical precision, and like all these other cases, there was no blood found on the body. So I'll wrap this up, Hercules, as I've rambled along long enough. I think that while the mythology of the vampire is extremely interesting and should be studied, I think that we can't rule out the possibility that this mythology probably has a basis in truth that occasionally will rear its fanged head.
And what do you call it? You brought up so many interesting points that I know I made the right decision in making this a series because there are so many things to think about. And before we get to the questions, I just want to add a little bit to what you're saying. If you can summarize like what I'm all about in 2 words, it would be living mythology.
Mm-hmm.
And my life has been a way of living mythology or exploring living mythology. And the Olympians who I'm most attuned to, I've spent a lifetime exploring what are they, exactly. And the myths tell you they're shapeshifters, and they could take on any shape. They could appear in a number of different ways, and they could be animals, they could be human-looking. And in one myth where Semele, Dionysus' mother, was fooled by Hera into asking Zeus to show his true shape, he was a being of light.
Mm.
So the gods themselves are very fickle. And I played hide and seek with my gods, again, for a big chunk of my life, whether I explore them through Norse mythology, through Celtic mythology, through Taoism, through shamanism, whatever way I've taken, it's always led me to a cultural mask behind which is definitely something that is interacting, but it can interact through many different guises. And it's the same with the monsters in Greek mythology. Most all of them are children of Typhon and Echidna, but they're all different. The Nemean lion, the Stymphalian birds, all of these are children of the same monster parents who don't look alike, and neither do any of their offspring. So my exploration of the monsters is what's continuing here, and you're all experts in your own domain, and I'm looking forward to this unfolding. But again, we're limited on time, so I'll stop talking about me, and we will ask Athena. Now, Athena, you've researched this topic in greater detail, and I know you edited yourself to fit the 10 minutes. heavily because I heard a lot of this information. There is another dimension. I'll ask the questions first, and we'll go around. There is another dimension that is pre-literature, which is like the folkloric. And so these stories that were preserved in literature actually echoes of massive folklore, which was brought up by several of our speakers tonight, our panelists tonight. Can you give an example of like what was lifted from folklore in one of the vampire stories that you talked about?
Several things. A lot of times they're talking about either one stake through the heart, which in folklore didn't always work. Sometimes the stake bounced off, or removal of the heart. And I think Brian mentioned that very strongly that in Dracula, Bram Stoker used the latest technology. When Dracula came out, it was a sexy novel in many respects because it was like reading a James Bond novel to the Victorians. There was all this new stuff in it. And in the especially between the 1700s and early 1900s, when an area was affected by a vampire and they dug the vampire out of the grave, found a heart full of or liver full of blood, they would burn it and then mix the ashes with water and have people drink it because it would help cure them. Well, it certainly didn't work against tuberculosis. Dracula's the first time that they're trying to do things like blood transfusions to help the victims, which I thought was fantastic. Of course, they didn't know anything about blood type, and Lucy probably would have been going into shock from having the wrong kind of blood put in her and dying. But it was a good try. It was something scientific. It was modern, and a lot of times in Dracula, which I'll say is the first modern vampire novel, they're also using science as well as superstition. So that was one of the things that jumped out at me.
Thank you so very much. Brian, do you have any questions to ask Athena?
Well, gosh, this all goes back like 30 some years for me. Yeah, when I was beginning my career. But remembering that, Anne Rice passed away, very recently. And her book in the 70s, made such a splash, Interview with the Vampire. What do you make of, and I know this is going to open up a huge can of worms. What do you make of all of the religious idolatry in Stoker's Dracula and in Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire?
Well, basically, people used religion to keep the boogeyman at bay. It gave the church another control mechanism, another aspect of having power. It's like, if you believe in what we're telling you in church and whatever, we can protect you from these horrible creatures. And Anne Rice had a little bit different because Louis liked to look at crosses. He thought they were kind of cool. And the Interview with the Vampire was a big departure from all the other vampire literature up until then, because it was basically taken from the vampire's point of view. Before that, everything focused on the victims and their seduction and yada, yada, yada. And this one, basically, Louis and Lestat are, all right, we'll just restrain him and leave him, or we'll, in the case of Claudia, she got turned. But other than that, they really didn't mess with humans other than as little juice containers or whatever for blood. So it was a much different take than what had gone before. So,
thank you very much. Circe, do you have any questions to ask Athena?
She might have froze.
Yeah, she might have.
Sorry, I had so these literary connections that are being made, we know that a lot of authors do the research and they do immersions into the cultures and different religions to write more. And recently in New Orleans, I had visited and learned about the Anne Rice history and stuff like that as well. Do you think that a lot of times it's because people can't explain something that they make up this exaggerated story, then creating more fascination for it?
It could be. I mean, as far as the folklore vampires go, vampirism was a good explanation for people that didn't know science for, say, tuberculosis. Here you have a wasting disease that seems to suck the life out of people, and it goes through families. So then you get the thing that the vampires could return and carry off members of their family. The family members are going to have nightmares, like in the Mercy Brown case of Mercy Brown. That was Rhode Island, by the way. And just before Stoker's Dracula, too. Mercy would come back from the grave, they thought, and she was sucking the life out of her family. And they actually dug up her grave, and they found out her heart and liver still had blood in it. And they thought that was proof that she was a vampire. Actually, what it was she died in the winter, and back then they couldn't dig the ground up, so they would put people in above ground crypts. So she was basically refrigerized. She was nice and fresh as far as they were concerned. So that's how that happened. But it was an explanation for all these things. If you have a horrible disease, next time we're on, I'll go into something that happened in Serbia, where I'm pretty sure there was a rabies epidemic going on. And again, blaming vampires.
Thank you very much. Olaf, do you have any questions for Athena?
Yeah, I was curious what the oldest vampire story you had found is, the written account.
For written,
Yeah.
Probably the earliest one goes to, I think I wrote it as a note, but I was going to save it for next show. It was written around 1689 by Johann Weichard von Valbosot for the glory of the Duchy of Carniola. There was a vampire in Croatia named Juri Grando, who lived between 1579 and 1656 in the village of Kringa. And after death, he returned as a vampire, and he was attacking other villagers and banging on their door. And if they answered, somebody in the house would die. And he sexually assaulted several. And he was the one the stake bounced off his chest, I mentioned. So the priest didn't know what to say. And finally, they tracked him supposedly to his grave, did an exorcism, and decapitated him. And that was the end of him. Now, Kringa's kind of embraced this. This has become the Croatian Dracula. But it was written about in this travel log. So this is what I mean about the pre-literature vampires that were fiction. This was all over the place with travel logs, medical journals, and newspapers and other forms of journalism where they were taking it quite seriously. And sometimes them doing it was saying, oh, well, those people in Rhode Island are yokels, look what they believe in. But other times it was like, wow, look what happened in this village. They had an actual vampire there. So again, the oldest one is probably dating back to the 1600s as a written account of a vampire. I hope that
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. Tim, do you have any questions to ask Athena?
Yeah, I was just wondering, you look at all of the old literature concerning vampires and compare it to how it has continued up until modern times. I mean, I know when I was a kid, you had comic books that had vampires both as the antagonist and protagonist. Now you have books like Anne Rice and Twilight. Is there much of a difference between what was written about in the past and today, or are we seeing an evolution, so to speak, on the vampire legend?
Definitely an evolution. Think of a vampire as a time capsule, and also like just how hard it would be to be immortal. Everyone is going to die or whatever. And vampires are very much a product of their time. So if you have a very superstitious, a very church-dominated culture, you're going to have, the crosses and everything else. And it changes to when we get to Carmilla and the aristocratic vampires like Lord Ruthven, that to make it more interesting to an audience that reads, you place it not with peasants, you're going to place it with the other aristocracy. And people want the vampires to be more and more accessible. I actually don't really like the idea that vampires make good boyfriends. Really hated Twilight with fiery passion. But this is the way it changes because people are attracted. They have this flirtation with death, but yet they want to be immortal. And what is going to be the nicest packaging for this? So vampires went from, hi, this is, creature of the night is just going to attack you, to, hi, this creature of the night is going to seduce you, to, what can I do to make myself more attractive to that vampire? So this is how it changed over the years. So you're going to see this evolution with the way vampires are presented. Movies nowadays are finding new ways and new things to do. Sometimes they harken back because originally vampires weren't really bothered that much by daylight. They were a little weakened and they didn't like it. But even Carmilla and Barney and Count Dracula himself were out in the daytime. I mean, Dracula even wore straw boater. I bet that was very fashionable, but that's how it goes. So I would say definitely we will see changes in vampires and how they're presented. People will explore new ways that the vampires are. I think Dark Shadows started with vampirism isn't a disease, Julia. Thinking that it might be some medical condition that you could cure rather than a curse. And anyway, there's so many different ways to look at it, and it's going to change as society changes and our attraction to the vampire changes.
Thank you so very much. And now we move to Brian. Brian, you're the expert on retro movies and a lot of non-retro movies on the subject of monsters. What is your favorite depiction cinematically of the vampire and why?
Well, I've got two, and I'm going to split it up that way. The first one for me, it's got to be Bela Lugosi's Dracula. It's the first film representation that I can remember of Count Dracula, and it's the one that has resonated with me throughout my whole life. Now that said, I cut my teeth, so to speak, pun intended, on Dark Shadows as a small child. It was a soap opera that my mother and I used to watch every afternoon. And Barnabas Collins, he is that stereotypical. He's a very romantic figure, and at the same time, he's a hungry animal, and I like that dichotomy. And he is a tortured soul, in the old soap opera from ABC in the 1960s, but it also makes for great viewing. If you'll recall, Dark Shadows was on when we were all so little, so young, but the first, I think, 8 or 9 months of the soap opera used other supernatural images and other monsters, but it really took hold when Jonathan Frid showed up as Barnabas Collins, and his portrayal of the vampire reminds me a lot of Bela Lugosi's, in that he's aristocratic, he has airs, he has a bearing. He's a very sophisticated vampire. He's not just a wolf. He's highly intelligent, just like Bram Stoker's Dracula. It makes for a very just an incredibly interesting character.
Thank you, sir. Athena, do you have any questions for Brian?
Oh, there's so many, because we both like talking about old movies and stuff like that. I know Universal had not only Bela Lugosi as Dracula, they also had John Carradine and Lon Chaney Jr. as Count Alucard.
Yes.
And out of the like the old ones, say all the ones pre-Hammer or whatever, which one was your favorite depiction of Dracula?
Lon Chaney. He's very good in Son of Dracula. And Lon Chaney had a lot of personal demons, from what I understand, but a lot that didn't really show when he was in front of the camera. He was he was seemingly a good every monster. Yeah. Well, he was the actor who did every monster, on the Universal lot. He was Frankenstein, Wolfman, Dracula. I mean, you name it. He's a little bit of everything.
Mummy too.
Yes, and he's, like I said, good at all of it. But with Frankenstein, you don't get to verbalize much, and the same thing with the Wolfman. Although Larry Talbot, Larry Talbot got to engage in some dramatics, but the Wolfman is just beast. He was just animal. And I thought he did a great job in Son of Dracula, portraying the Count as somebody aristocratic, as an animal at the same time. And he looks great doing it. I mean, Lon wasn't a handsome man necessarily, but you can see that he's probably lost like 30 pounds or so in order to play the part. He's trim, he's in great shape, and he does a fantastic job. I got to say, back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, if you wanted to cast a horror film, could you really go wrong with either John Carradine, or Lon Chaney Jr.? They were both fantastic, and they were in so many movies. I mean, neither one of them were very likely to turn down a role. But that's what you have to do to survive, as an entertainer. Very few people can say no to gigs.
Thank you very much. Circe, do you have any questions to ask Brian?
Not mute. Okay, there. Yeah. So where do you think we might see the vampire movies going now? We've done like the traditional, we want to scare the heck out of you. We're falling in love with them. What do you think might be the future for vampire movies now?
Well, we've already romanticized the vampires, and Twilight, I guess, is probably the most shining example of that. But why couldn't you have, let's say a storyline where vampires coexist with humans in society, and not just from the standpoint of food, but a coexistence. Sort of like what you see at the end of Shaun of the Dead, where the zombies are sort of put to use for the humans. I could see something like that happen with vampires as well.
Thank you very much. Olaf, do you have any questions to ask Brian?
Yeah, I was curious what you thought about the shift in more modern vampire films, from the idea that it's this curse, that it's a demonic in nature, to being more of like a blood disorder or like a viral infection. So I mean, you start to see that with The Hunger, and then from The Hunger on, you start to see like The Stand, and I was just curious.
Yeah, The Hunger is a great book. Good movie too, by the way. Well, society has sort of shifted away from, and I think Athena, touched on this. Society sort of shifted away from trying to use religion to explain everything, and now, we're a much more science-based world. We look at it as not, as she said, not a curse so much, but as a disorder. And we're still in the middle of a pandemic, I should say, but watching the scientific end of it, watching the technology roll out so quickly. I mean, is it a wonder that somebody might not take a storyline with a vampire and for them make it so that they, and as with Grayson Hall and Jonathan Frid in Dark Shadows, make vampirism sort of survive in a sense, even though they are undead.
Thank you very much. And Tim, do you have any questions to ask Brian?
Yeah, not including Twilight, what would you say out of all the vampire movies that you've seen is the one that's this the most bizarre out there, the one that you would tell people, you got to watch this, this is just crazy? Yeah.
Well, you touched on some of the Mexican vampire movies, which I used to love back in the 50s and 60s. If you remember Commander USA on the USA Network, he used to run them back in the 80s. And that was my first exposure to them. It was so much fun to watch. Movies like The Brainiac, for example, where I'd be hard pressed to call the Brainiac a vampire, but he does have that tongue that does seem to allow him to do whatever it is that he does. I love Mexican vampire movies. Mexican horror movies in general are brilliant, but the vampire movies are so much fun.
Thank you very much. And now we move on to Circe. Circe, we share a cultural background, and we grew up with a lot of the same stories, both the mythology and the folklore and so forth. And you talked about the Lamia and equated her with vampires, and that was done in antiquity. Philostratos, and I know that because I'm a Lemnian and he was a Lemnian, wrote a book about Apollonius of Tyana, and he talked about the devastation that a Lamia can cause. And the Lamia was a type of succubus, and a tale was related about how she'd wormed her way into very rich circles and caused devastation in a man's life, and destroyed him and his family and so forth, until Apollonius stopped her. And yes, you talked about the serpent qualities of the Lamia; those were very prevalent. And you showed very clearly how that ties in with our modern mythology on the succubus. What other stories did you hear at grandma's knee or at mom or dad's knee that?
Well, they were more esoteric. It was more of like warnings, like don't do this, or this creature will get you. So a lot of it had to do with preying on curiosity, or something that the society believed would be shameful if people found out. So women traditionally should have been more at home. So if you were out late, that's why you're going to be seduced, or you're going to become one of these women of the night type seductresses that will ruin a man, because only women that are out late will do this. So it was more, I'd never heard of specific names per se, as more as just general warnings growing up and trying to teach you cultural values in that society, in the Greek society. My father would always tell me, you don't want Zeus to come down and hit you with his thunderbolt if you lie. So it kind of gave the essence of like, if you lie, Zeus doesn't like it and he'll hit you with a thunderbolt. So it was more so warnings than actual creatures that would these creatures would come out and get you. But he never really gave names to them. And my grandmother would give me, though, more of the women aspect. So like, if you need something to be figured out, you have to talk to Athena, or
I do.
Yeah. So these are the things, like, so you went by the aspect of what the god was known for, and those are the people that you went to for different counseling. So your house was in trouble, you might want to ask Hecate for help. You're having love marital problems, go to Athena, Aphrodite. So mainly the gods were there to help and hurt, depending upon what you did or what you didn't do. So then you would have these stories of creatures that would do similar things, such as the Lamia, who if men weren't careful, she could weasel her way in, snake her way in to your life, and then steal everything from you. So it's more of a warning, cautionary thing, I would think, and that's why these stories were created. So that's more so what I got from my upbringing.
Thank you very much. Athena, do you have any questions to ask Circe?
I actually went totally blank. No, I don't think I did, because she covered this, covered the subject so well. It's like I pretty much, and also I know a lot of these myths and legends well, and her presentation was excellent.
Thank you. Brian, do you have any questions for Circe?
Well, just more an observation than anything else. As somebody who is not fantastically well versed in Christianity, I did not grow up in the church, as a child, and haven't done a whole lot with it as an adult either. Where do you see this going in the next 30 or 40 years?
Well, I see it almost like, okay, so like how movies are created, and it's going to become more of like guidelines that people were told to control them. And as it was, so you wanted your child to be obedient, you told them these horror stories, much like Grimm's fairy tales. So if you wanted a populace to be controlled, okay, so in Catholicism, a man's dreams were invaded by a succubus. It could be his subconscious that he's desiring a woman, and that woman has to be a succubus because she's in my mind now. So it's a way to excuse his behavior or find fault for, and it's not his shame that his subconscious really wants this woman, that she must be a demon succubus invading his mind. So, I mean, a lot of it going forward has to do with shadow work, like not in denial of your subconscious or in denial of your shameful human qualities, but it fully accepting it and becoming a real person, knowing who you are. And it's okay, like, sure, you could have a desire for a woman. It doesn't mean you have to act upon it. I mean, instead of being controlled by these things and being told that it's wrong or it's hurtful, maybe we can say, oh, it's human to be like that.
Thank you very much. Olav, do you have a question to ask for Circe?
Yeah, actually, when you were talking, you were saying that when you were a kid, that your grandmother or your father would tell you these stories. Zeus will hit you with a lightning bolt. I was curious how that integrates into kind of the modern religion, because it's folk religion, right? But is there an acceptance of that in the church, like the Greek Orthodox Church? Do they just turn a blind eye to it? Or, I mean, how do they reconcile the non-Christian nature of a polytheistic religion versus a monotheistic religion?
Oh, that's a 10 episode.
Okay, so
I mean, the basic version, it's like
because hypocrite. Okay, so and they're going to reference Zeus and Athena and Hera doing all these hard. Okay, and then on the other side, but go to church because it's funny because most Greeks are now the Greek Orthodox,
right.
And there's no talk at all of Zeus or anything like that. You don't hear that, but they will do customs that reference a lot of that, and I'm like, but wait. How is that making sense? And it doesn't. It's something that was ingrained in you as a culture, but yet there's no reference to it being religious anymore. So
it's cultural.
Whereas we don't have temples that we go to Zeus anymore or to Apollo, we do have the remnants of that in Greece. So people do honor that still, yet they hold their Orthodox, Greek Orthodox religion higher than that now. So the culture is respected in that aspect, but the religious aspect of doing ritual for Apollo or Zeus really doesn't happen anymore, unless it's done privately or in your own time.
Yeah, because I mean, you see that a lot in Catholicism, that folk religions are,
right.
They're not suppressed per se, they're just not discussed. It's like you go to Catholic Church, be it Greek Orthodox or whatever, Russian Orthodox or the Vatican. You go to church and that's all great, but at home you still do these things.
Yep.
Like, when I was a little kid, I grew up in Italy, and I would put my shoes outside for the Christmas witch to put candy in.
Mhm.
Not a good thing in a
Right.
Catholic country, but it's generally accepted. I was
Right.
just curious.
Yeah, no, because my grandmother used to always tell me, put a plate of food outside for Hecate, because that was, the household goddess that would watch over, and you usually put a
Right.
plate of food out as an offering so that she would bless your house. Now, that the thing is, she was Greek Orthodox, so I'm like, why are we doing this if you don't believe? And she goes, no, you have to do this for the god. If you don't, and it was like, geez, you're still afraid of the gods, but yet you're practicing this religion. It's very
Yeah.
hypocritical, but it's also, that's how you got raised. You had
Right.
to respect both, just in
Okay.
case.
Just in case. Fair enough.
Yeah, we're a culture that broke off from the Catholic Church because the Catholics had statues and we had icons.
Yeah, no.
And yet, go to any house, including mine, and all you'll see on every single surface is statues of some sort.
Okay, my church broke off from the Catholics because Henry VIII wanted a divorce.
That's
so
right.
It's all good.
That's what I used to tell my
Tim,
mom.
Okay. What'd you say, Athena? I didn't hear. I'm sorry.
No, about Henry VIII wanting a quickie divorce. That's why I tell my mom, and boy, was that not appreciated.
Tim, do you have any questions for Circe?
Well, actually, Olav asked it. I was pretty much going to ask about the same thing. I was just, curious on how, Christianity rather kind of encroached and brought in a lot of these stories for themselves, like the succubus and the incubus, and said, oh no, we did it first. Yeah, it's all us, but I think
Right.
I think what you said to Olav, pretty much answered that.
And again, because I'm Greek, I'm just going to throw in another couple of sentences here. It was very syncretic too. They adopted a lot of the heroes and made them into saints.
Yeah.
So
Right.
Hercules was Saint Luke, because at that time, during the first centuries, he was known more for his health spas and hospitals and gyms than he was for his 12 laborers. Okay, so now we go to Olav. Olav, you brought up the worldwide distribution of vampire lore and the various forms it takes. And I'm going to borrow from Tim here and ask, which was the strangest to you and why?
I don't know if it's the strangest. The one that I personally find the most fascinating is the Aswang in the Philippines. And I think it's because the belief in it is so pervasive across the entire archipelago. And, people claim to this day that they can see the island floating, or the island is out there, in the ocean, and you can see the bodies floating. I mean, I know somebody who's my age, who said, yes, I've seen it. I went back to the Philippines. This was a long time ago. She said, yes, I went back to the Philippines to visit my family. And while I was there, I saw it at sunset when the sky is blood red, and you can just see the bodies like drifting in the waves. And, it's so pervasive. And it's very, on one hand, they're almost like cryptids, but on the other hand, they're almost like that classic Nosferatu, the rotting person who's cursed, right? So they're like both. And the belief is just so pervasive. Like go anywhere in the Philippines and ask about the Aswang, and they'll tell you all about it.
Thank you very much. And I want to,
Sure.
We're at 8:30. I have 20 more minutes until I have to start another show. Do you guys want to continue for like the next 20 minutes, or should we just continue in part 2 of Vampire?
Let's do this as part 2.
Yeah.
Okay. So part 2?
Yeah.
Sure.
So part 2, we'll pick up where we left off, and we'll
Okay.
start with Olav. And then after we finish going through the questions for part 1, we'll do a new round of topical presentations. Now that we've heard each other and what we had to say, we'll take our exploration a little bit further. Okay, so before we sign out, I'm going to go around, and anyone who wants to share contact information and draw attention to a project that's coming up may do so. Athena, if people want to follow you or contact you, how may they do so?
Basically,
Your sound conked out again. Still out.
under
Oh, there it is.
in a dark victory.
Okay. Can you repeat it? The sound just came on.
Oh, okay. Pretty much, you can find me on a variety of social platforms, either for Athena Victory, or we put the we in Halloween. I would warn you that, however, I don't use my Twitter account much because I just can't cope with it. But I have Cafe Press, eBay, YouTube channel, and Facebook. So you can
Thank
find
you
me.
very much. Brian.
Yes, you can find me at Brian's Drive-In Theater, www.brian, Brett's Brian with an I, briansdriveintheater.com. I am on Facebook and Twitter. I am a lurker on Twitter only, so don't look for me to post. But I am in Twitter every day, looking around, seeing what I can find. If you want to interact with me, Facebook is by far the better of the two platforms.
Thank you very much. Circe.
Okay. So on Facebook, I'm Penny Lane. And I also have a website, Night Witch Crafts, and I could be found on Instagram as that as well, NYTE Witch Crafts. So I do jewelry design and stuff like that.
Very awesome. Thank you very much. Olaf.
Yeah, you can find me as Paranoia Mags on Instagram or the Hermetic Assembly of Light.org. I'm also on Facebook, but I don't hang out there much anymore because similar to Twitter, I can't take it. But I do check it. If you send me a message, I will get it.
Awesome. And Tim, how about you?
Yeah, you can find my website. It's conspiracyjournal.com, just how it sounds, conspiracyjournal.com. We also have a book that myself, Scott Corrales, Tim Beckley put out a couple of years ago called Alien Bloodlust. Are there vampires in space? And it's actually a reprint of a book that Scott Corrales did dealing with the Chupacabra phenomena, but we added a bunch of extra stuff to it as well to make it more fit the UFO and other paranormal aspects of the vampire mythology. And it's a really great book. I highly recommend it.
It is. I'm in it actually, and I don't remember exactly what I contributed to it, but it had a lot to do with Greek mythology, I'm sure. Thank you to everybody. This show and all the shows in the series are dedicated to the memory of Timothy Green Beckley. Many of us here have been associated with Tim directly or indirectly. So thank you, Tim, for bringing us all together. And to be continued. Take care, everybody. Thank you very much. Have an awesome day.
Ta-ta for now.